everybody. Thank you for joining us for our next virtual Future Talks event. I'm Lauren Keeler. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm part of New Relic's corporate social responsibility team, otherwise known as newrelic.org. Through our community programs, we're committed to creating a more equitable, just, and accessible tech sector. And so we're really proud to be able to offer free events like Future Talks to provide our community with opportunities to hear about topics and trends impacting the tech community. As a reminder, Future Talks is typically in person, and we're joined by members of our recruiting team. Since we're virtual today, please visit our career page to check out our list of open positions. And we've got the Q&A feature live and running, so please submit your questions there, and we'll answer a few at the end of our chat. So why are we here? Today's pace of technological change is unprecedented. Despite a global pandemic, this change has only accelerated, putting the globe's more than 10 million nonprofits at risk of falling behind. Used properly, modern technology can help organizations streamline processes, increase impact, and drive tangible solutions to the world's most complex problems. But barriers like access, time, expertise to implement, and systemic underfunding really challenge digital transformation initiatives across the sector. But there's hope, which is why we're here. Through radical collaboration and impact focus and uncommon generosity, the corporate tech sector can begin to shift the tide for this growing problem. So we've gathered an incredible panel of experts who are here to discuss tackling the problem of technology access for social impact and the solutions that are being attempted throughout the industry. So without further ado, I'm happy to introduce our panelists. We've got Adam Rosenzweig, Senior Manager for Product Impact at Okta, industry expert Brian Breckenridge, Chris Borman, VP of Alliances and Program Development at Techsoup, Megamo Nesbitt, Senior Director of Nonprofit Market Development at Twilio, Meredith Delich, Google for Nonprofits Team Lead, Rakesh Barania, Director of Humanitarian Impact Data at Salesforce.org, and last but not least, our moderator, Matt Shandera, who leads New Relic's Observability for Good program to get the conversation started. So I'll hand it over to Matt.
Thanks, Lauren. This is a fantastic, and well, first off, thank you so much for the panel attendees. You guys are incredible folks, and super glad to have you joined alongside of us in this conversation. What we're about to tackle is probably a little bit misunderstood conversation in the global sphere, but as technology begins to accelerate or continues to accelerate across the globe, it's beginning to compromise some of the world's most critical infrastructure. Those are the organizations that Lauren referenced, 10 million plus, that support all the social impact across the globe. And so what I'd love to do first to start our conversation is I'd love for Chris from TechSoup, if you would kind of set up the problem for us, help us understand it a little bit, dig into that, give us some numbers, whatever you've got to help us get familiar with where we're at. Go ahead and do that.
Sure. Well, thanks. It's great to be here with a group of folks working on this critical issue. And at the risk of sounding too negative, I might frame a couple of problems and an opportunity. So the opportunity to me looks like ECAS. Through a human-centered design process, our partners in Ireland built ECAS, which was a fit-for-purpose case management solution with a bunch of nonprofits delivering addiction services, perhaps due to some pride of ownership, or perhaps because it actually met their needs. Some 80% of Irish addiction services organizations use it. They save an average of $85,000 a year by having more efficient tech, which is great. It's not like they have a lot of money. And second, and potentially more importantly, they generate data in the same format and use it to sit down with the Irish government and help drive policy. That last point is critical to the opportunity. Thanks to ECAS, they can bring forward data from communities who've been invisible, data that only nonprofits have, to inform policy and influence system change. So where's the problem? Well, there are several baked into this. One is that we all get really excited about stories like ECAS, and we take for granted what it required. The combination of near ubiquitous internet access, a strong nonprofit tech capacity building partner specialized in human-centered design, access to Salesforce products upon which to build the app, and the Salesforce funding to do so. That we all too often take digital infrastructure for granted and jump to the fun stuff is a problem because half of humanity doesn't have the internet. Ireland does. Many people don't. Millions of nonprofits who serve people do not have ready access to the kinds of digital infrastructures and services that led to ECAS. much less the know-how how to use the tools, the human or philanthropic support necessary to build such an app, etc. After 30 years of work in the sector and lots of research, trust me, these are organizations who don't have tech staff. They don't have tech strategies. They don't have a lot of opportunity to sit around and think about how far tech could take them. But to a point you raised, Matt, they provide critical services to billions of people, and they need tech. So the good news, perhaps, is, and I think we're going to talk more about this later today, these gaps and problems can be solved through collaboration, the kinds of radical collaboration that was raised by putting down the nonprofit corporate and foundation egos and focusing on nonprofit needs, first and foremost, pooling the resources, working to design scalable solutions to address problems, or we run into the serious problem, which is the risk, as you mentioned, that as we accelerate, particularly to the cloud, that millions of nonprofits are left behind by digitalization, specifically that, and that as their on-premise software begins to fail, the data and insights they hold disappears. The evidence and voices of the millions of people they serve who are already on the margins, also being left behind by digitalization, are further isolated and less served. So one beautiful opportunity that I think we can all appreciate with some pretty serious problems baked in to help us get more of what we want.
That's fantastic. Rakesh, I saw you nodding your head over there, and I was going to come to you for some color on that next.
Yeah, it's really interesting. This moment, this last year really has been really highlighted the challenge and also the opportunity ahead of us. So I think on the challenge side, if we look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which are essentially the to-do list for humanity, many of those goals were actually progressing quite well. So reductions in extreme poverty, child and maternal mortality was going down, more people were gaining access to electricity around the world. And so many of these indicators were actually trending in the right way. And then obviously the pandemic struck. And when the pandemic struck, what we saw around the world was a number of these indicators essentially reversed almost more than a decade of progress in just a matter of months. So we saw a growth of extreme poverty. We saw for the first time since 1998. We saw more people becoming food insecure. And of course, what we've seen is a sort of an intersectional or a spillover effect where the COVID-19 pandemic has really had an impact on every single one of the 17 SDGs. And what began as a health crisis is basically become a human and socioeconomic crisis. And of course, nonprofits and social impact organizations are on the front lines of that in every corner of the planet, whether here in the United States or elsewhere around the planet. Now, at the same time, how do we respond to that at the same time where we're dealing with things like compassion fatigue or reductions in donations, because obviously people are trying to take care of their own situation. And really technology has the promise of being a major scaling effect. And I think that's the thing. Now, TechSoup did do a survey last summer in July of last year. And in that TechSoup survey, they found that only about 25% of the 38,000 nonprofits they surveyed actually had a strategy towards digital transformation. And yet what we saw was almost everybody had to undergo an emergency digital transformation last year, right? So COVID-19 was a major forcing element for adopting digital, whether you wanted to or not. And I think that what we can do from the technology industry is help smooth that shock. I think that we can provide the capacities and the technologies, as well as the wherewithal to enable all these mission-focused organizations to really deliver the best work they possibly can, because certainly I think we would all agree that the world really needs them to be at the top of their game right now, because if we want to get back on track with the SDGs, if we want to get back on all of the different crises, whether it's the racial crisis here in the United States or extreme poverty around the world, or choose your challenge, we need to do this all together.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And one of the things that weaves together what both of you have said was just at the same time that this rapid, even more so, digitization of everyday workflow through COVID has happened. Many of these nonprofits, probably the majority of them, were caught behind the eight ball in a sense, that underfunded, and didn't have that great plan to move to the cloud, weren't really able to pivot as well. And so not only is the world fundamentally changed today, they are left even further behind because they had no capacity to be able to do that. So I think in the scope of problem, we could dig into that for easily another hour and talk about that. But and I think in general, though, the folks that are at least on this call, and hopefully those of you that are listening in, we understand kind of why it's important not only that we engage this, but become part of the solution as well as part of the tech sector. So for you, if you're listening in and you're one of the organizations, you work for a technology company and you're beginning to think through some of this, there's some steps to being able to jump into this conversation at a global scale. And I think I'd like for us to walk through that a little bit and really talking about the other side of this, right? On one hand, it seems altruistic and great to give away our technology and like present it to the world, and like that's going to be some magical solution. But those of us that work in the industry know that it's not quite so simple as that. We have to balance corporate priorities as well as the fact that it's not just as easy as giving away your technology as a miracle solution. And so I'd love for us to take just a moment and talk about this idea of finding the balance, if there is such a thing, between social impact and things like revenue or corporate investment. And can I kick it over to you, Megamo, to start that conversation?
Absolutely. It's interesting. One of the things that Rakesh said was talking about technology as it can be the scaling effect in driving impact. And I think when we think about, okay, companies that do have technologies that may be appropriate for certain social impact challenges, what are the distribution mechanisms and programs to get that technology accessible? And myth number one, you make technology free, that makes it accessible. Like we've seen for years and decades of software being donated and turning into shelfware, that isn't actually the right first step. But how do we think about how we get the technology into the hands of innovators and those people, like Chris mentioned, the people who are working in the front lines, who have the understanding of what it takes to build a case management system that actually captures the insights of battling addiction and make sure that the right technology is appropriate to those folks. And I think there's, from my perspective, and I've done this a few times, I've done this at Twilio and Salesforce Foundation back in the day, but I think one of the most important things is programmatically allowing organizations to use your technology and harnessing the innovation from those organizations. And to do that programmatically and at scale, is there a way you can ensure there's a value exchange? So it's really hard to know if an organization or if an individual is using software because it's free. It's like you're walking by a garage sale and somebody's like, hey, this is free. You know, did they really need that light, or was it because it was free? And from my perspective, having some level of monetary value exchange can change the dynamic of the program for two really important reasons. One, it ensures the organization has assessed the value and determined if this is something worth investing in. And two, it changes the dynamic on accountability. I've seen a lot of companies say, hey, we've provided this, we gave it away, nothing, you go figure it out. And that can't be where a company's responsibility ends. We need to ensure that technologies get used and that they actually help solve problems. So from my perspective, there's a huge value in actually having a monetary value exchange and changing that dynamic to be more mutually accountable.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that we all kind of intrinsically know that's true, right? You just value things differently that you associate, that you pay for, right? Or that you invest your time and resources in. We do that as human beings. I'm curious how some of the rest of you have begun tackling this, and maybe Bri, like you've kind of sat across the industry in some unique ways. And so what are you seeing? But for the rest of you, feel free to just jump in there as well. Love to hear your perspective on this idea of a value exchange.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I appreciate you calling me out here on this. The thought that most of the companies born in Silicon Valley or born in other tech hubs or centers around the world, especially now that these organizations are serving their customers per se through cloud models or software as a service or on-demand models, those business models do not survive if the people engaging the technology are not in fact consuming and using the technology. And if there's one thing that you can assure yourself of for all of the great brands represented here on this call with my amazing peers, or just broader in our industry, the energy gets put behind building great product that does in fact solve problems and meet needs. Now, though the nonprofit sector, like every other niche sector, has its own unique requirements, but if the client base itself and if the company isn't committing itself to enabling those people consuming the technology, then their business models fail. Full stop. And so you see the rise over the past 10 or 15, 20 years of quote, customer success management in our sector. And so I would much rather, and this just goes back maybe because of the arc of my career, but aligning the good work of enabling the nonprofit sector in ways similar to how these organizations that I've represented and many of my peers have represented, with some of the same ammunition, firepower, support, services, human energy, IP, et cetera, that the company is leveraging toward its customers, right? So now suddenly enabling the use of the technology we've created, even if it needs to be tailored dramatically and capacity built around it, the motions or the commercial motions that the companies are massively investing in need to be aimed at the problems that the nonprofit sector are solving alongside any other customer. And I think the further afield that the offering that an organization brings to market philanthropically, even if it's through an enlightened social enterprise type business model, like many of the people on the call do, it's important to keep the motion or the experience of the nonprofit sector fairly close to where the resources are in the company. And maybe I'm saying this 3 times the same way, but in the end, if this work is done as a project and it sits outside of the core investments being made by the company to make clients successful, then nonprofits are going to continue to get less out of less, or less out of an attempt at more. Whereas if the client that lives in a nonprofit universe, seen as a grantee or seen as is also quote unquote seen as a customer, as much as there's this aversion to commercialize this work, it does bring the best resources to bear, as Megan had to say there. It's just there may be some nuance in the way that those things get delivered. Further barrier lowering, use of pro bono, lots of other interesting models and community helping community models that peer-to-peer that can be put in place as well.
Yeah, I see 3 primary avenues to this, right? You named one, which is what I would call customer enablement, right? Success is a lot of words for it, right? And it's not enough to even discount your software. It's making sure that nonprofits be successful on that technology. And then it's the value exchange element. And then it's the systems for delivery, right? Like, how do we actually get this out there as a tech company at scale? And so I'm not sure which one of you would love to jump in and talk about that, but Meredith, with Google, you've figured out scale to some capacity there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, the Google for Nonprofits program has been around. I think it's our 10th anniversary this year, so it predates me joining the team. But I think that going back to one of the things that Megamo kind of mentioned about, like, you put software out there and it's free. It's like people are going to sign up for the free thing, and the question is, are folks actually going to use it? And very much also to Bry's point about building your nonprofit offering, whatever it looks like, right? Whether it's free, whether it's discounted, into the ecosystem that you're already creating to support all of your customers. Those are the 2 things that I think have helped us a lot. The team that does Google for Nonprofits is very small, and we have a really wide reach, but it's not because we're just like insanely efficient, although we've gotten pretty good at being efficient. It's because we have figured out how to tap into the teams that are already in region, talking to and coming across nonprofits in their day-to-day conversations, making sure that they have the resources that they need to support the nonprofits they're talking to. We had a really interesting conversation with a number of the sales kind of leads that might just be out talking to organizations anyway during COVID to say, hey, look, there are very unique circumstances for nonprofits right now. Here's what you should be aware of. Here are the needs that we're hearing from nonprofits. And if you're having conversations or you're trying to talk to organizations about, the free offering that exists, or maybe the discounted offerings that exist for things like Google Workspace, just be aware of, the circumstances and be aware of kind of what nonprofits need and the resourcing that might be different. So, I think that's I would just very much echo, I think what Brian Megamo both kind of focused on, which is that, you have to think about how you are packaging even a free offering, right, around like the support that you're giving to organizations. And we think a lot, if you're in the tech space and you're thinking about, what does it look like to have a free offering or a couple of free seats or whatever it is for the particular tech that you have out there, we think a ton about active product usage. So for me, it's not success if somebody signs up for Google for Nonprofits and never does anything with any of the products in our suite, because that means that they didn't know what they were coming in to get and they didn't get what they wanted, right? And that's a waste of time for nonprofits, and none of us want that. So, we focus a lot, and I think bringing that product focused mindset of what do nonprofits need, asking them what they need, having them tell you again and again, like what would be easier about using your product, what would make it better for them in terms of how your product maybe is interoperable with other products they're already using. And that's a huge part of this collaborative space. All of those things I think are a really great starting point.
That's great. I heard a couple things in there. One, it sounds like to external scale is something that we think about, especially at the size of the organizations that are on this call. We think about that a lot, but it's predicated by internal systems that scale first before we be able to do that, kind of to both you and Bry's point, is to make sure that you can support your nonprofit customers in line and treat them like a regular customer is going to be a recipe for success. But then you can't just do that. You have to nuance the program and make sure that there's enough there that is unique value. And just like you would with any other different customer vertical, you would take a look at that and you would say, hey, we want to make sure we're catering our use cases and catering our product and our innovation towards this specific group of people. I'm curious, Adam, how Okta has been doing that over these last couple of years.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks everyone. I was having a lot of different thoughts as I was listening to my friends here share their perspectives, and I'm partially because of my maybe my personality, I'm tempted to sort of take a little bit of a devil's advocate approach, or maybe a contrarian position to what's been shared, just for the sake of a richer conversation. And so one of the things that I've learned over the last several years of partnering with nonprofits to acquire new technology and new products is that when you hear that something is too expensive, what you can translate that to in your mind is this is not valuable enough. Those two are equivalent statements, right? Organizations of all sizes come up with resources for the most critical things. And nonprofit leaders don't need to be taught how to prioritize or necessarily, they may need to understand how a new technology, a new thing in the world is valuable to them, right? They know their work really well. And so I think that's what's incumbent on us, if we're on the vendor side, right, is to communicate the value in their language. So we have to go out of our way and not just say, here's sort of the standard list products with the list prices, and here are the case studies and the white papers. That may not work. So we have to go out of our way to demonstrate the value, if that value is really there. But here's maybe the contrarian point, which is, I think it's somewhat trite to say that every organization is becoming a technology organization, but it's also in some ways true. Meaning that we know that technology is pervading every aspect of modern life. And Chris started us off by saying that they're pointing out the fact that there are so many organizations and people that lack that access. But I would say that for the most part, those organizations are striving to operate in the world that has access to this stuff. So the world that people are working towards is a connected world. And if every organization is becoming a technology organization, then what that means is that every role is becoming a technology-enabled role. Part of that is generational, right? We have digital natives working in our organizations increasingly. People are sort of born, depending on where you're born and the circumstances you're born into, knowing, how to use technology to do kind of basic things. And so I think that what we're going to see over the next several years increasingly is people who sort of naturally expect to bring consumer grade technology and sort of consumer technology mindsets to every aspect of their work. Things should be more seamless, things should be faster, things are going to be global first. And so it really suggests that there's a human element of this that's going to be very interesting. That the people needing to learn new tools and technologies. That's not unique to nonprofits. So I don't think that it's contrarian necessarily to say, if you're working in a mission-driven organization, if you're working in the social space, you should be prepared to spend your career learning new technologies and skills. I don't think that that's putting undue burden on folks, because that's the expectation that I think everybody who's working towards any goal should have. That's just what working in the modern world means.
The one thing I was just going to add, Adam, is that I think, anyone who's ever worked at a smaller sized nonprofit knows that you already wear 6 different hats, right? Like the folks who we speak with that are trying to set their nonprofit up with email also run all of their social media and also help manage a lot of their externally facing programs. So I do think that maybe more uniquely in the nonprofit space, people are already familiar with that, like context switching and always needing to maybe learn that new skill set. And it's even more in the tech focused world, like how do we get all the resources to folks, assuming that they're going to be wearing a lot of different hats as well.
And I think we have to understand that context. We really do. I mean, like from a technology perspective, we need to understand that, to design for our end users, but realize those of us here on the panel, we are not representative of our end users, right? So people who are in these mission-focused organizations who are wearing those 6 hats, as Meredith just said, they are time shifting and context shifting and code switching constantly. And so, when we talk about scale in technology, we often talk about scaling up. We got to scale to the globe, and Googles and Facebooks and Salesforces of the world and all the other big tech companies. We always think about scale going up. And the vast majority of those 10 million nonprofits are small organizations with a handful of individuals in them. And so we have to design for, not just consuming by those organizations, but how can they be successful in their mission with these technologies at that scale? And so, and I would say, to be contrarian, to take a page out of Adam's book, I would say that this is actually something that the technology industry is not great at. We are not good about having conversations about scaling down. We are always much more comfortable talking about scaling up. And I think that when we want to have an impact, the most impactful organizations are the local community-based ones who actually know their constituencies and are deeply embedded in the problem space. And so, dealing with a global international nonprofit is a very different thing than dealing with a local homeless shelter a mile or 2 away from my house.
Yeah, because you can bet.
Go ahead, Bri.
I'll be very brief on this, Megan, but I was going to say, you can bet that the woman that runs that shelter in the East Bay here in the San Francisco Bay Area, when the phone rings, it could be her donor, it could be her client that's in to get her meal, it could be her kids getting home from school. I mean, it's, to your point, that code switching thing is real among the many hundreds of thousands or millions of nonprofits of the 10 million that are 1 or 0 staff and staffed by volunteers who are collaborating in this space. But then the next time the phone rings, it's certainly not the only thing they're focused on. So I do think there's a lot of merit in what you'd said, and that is another example of some exceptions in some of the momentum that tech companies or Silicon Valley need to have in this area to bring the most value to this constituent. Over to you, Megamo.
I'm playing the contrarian game, Matt. I don't know if there was a section about contrarian, but I just want to make sure that, from my perspective anyway, I don't want to conflate large NGOs with that's where technology innovation happens, and that's the exclusive realm for tech innovation. That's not what my experience has seen anyway. I've seen, sure, there can be, but I see organizations like Trans Lifeline that was started by a few volunteers, and they created a hotline that was staffed for answering responses to folks with trans issues, and it's amazing. And this is a small organization, and they've used technology to make a really critical resource widely available to a vulnerable community. And I think a number of us have seen this. So I think making sure technology is accessible and appropriate for the problem that it seeks to solve, but not discounting the innovation and the brilliance that we see coming from people who are trying to create social change. So that's my one soapbox.
I'm super glad you brought that up, Megan. I think there's a fun sort of like Mythbusters style show that we could do here next time. There are a few things that, one, I mean, this meme that big organizations are somehow better at saving the world is entirely ludicrous and entirely denies the reality of the big organization community, which is they're based on the work of thousands often of little local branches and partners. All that data and programmatic work filters up to them. And yes, do you need those big organizations for certain things? Absolutely. But they're based on huge communities of little nonprofits a lot of the time. And so like this sort of dichotomy of like bigger is better or smaller, yeah, it's not true. And I think this is something to think about. You know, Rakesh brought up, or I think it was Rakesh brought up, that a lot of these organizations are tiny. TechSoup, with you all, you know, together in our partnerships, has grown to serving now about 1.3 million organizations around the world. 83% last time I heard were 5 people or under. That's normal. That is the nonprofit sector. And all of us know that intrinsically. Any of you that grew up in the United States, any of you that grew up in, you know, parts of the world with a very vibrant, recognizable nonprofit sector, because it's not always recognizable, think about it. Little League, swim teams, choirs. Both of my sisters were adopted. These were all small nonprofits. Did they need tech? Absolutely. Were they super tech innovative? Yeah, some were, some weren't. The swim team wasn't. I'm pretty sure about that. But no offense, swimmers. But there, you know, it's an incredibly diverse sector. And I think thinking about that for anybody who's trying to get into these programs, to anybody that's trying to grow with, you know, with a partner like TechSoup or not, to reach smaller and smaller organizations, 2 things that I think have come up in the discussion that I think I would address in addition. One is that none of our products, and I think I can say that with some confidence, no single corporation is the only technology solution you need. And that there's an enormous amount of work to be done at the edges to help nonprofits integrate better. We see a lot of problems in nonprofits capturing data here, trying to move it here, trying to move it here, trying to move it here. And if you want to talk about customer success, that's a really interesting thing that a lot of sales engineers do to help with integrations amongst products, but they don't necessarily do it for little nonprofits. I think that's a place where we could be spending more time and effort to solve for data loss and various other complications therein. And then I think I'm really glad this sort of cost of adoption came up. And I think it's something that it's worth us thinking about. There's the cost of the product, but then there's the cost, like a total cost of adoption of a new solution when you don't have a lot of internal training and support. And thinking about what is the total cost of adoption so that we can look at what our real intended outcomes are individually and as a community, and then asking those critical questions. Why don't we have that already? Why isn't every nonprofit on the planet already operating at full technical capacity? And working backwards through some of the barriers that are there, like integrations, they don't know where to get started, like costs of adoption. And I think that's a really interesting place to then think, if you're addressing sort of customer success and cost of adoption, if we can identify some of those barriers, which of those can we give away for free? Like, where are the blueprint models that say, hey, everybody, if you're a organization like the helpline that Megamo just talked about, you're a helpline. These are the sorts of products and integrations that you're going to need. Now, getting the products, distribution is not necessarily a challenge we have anymore, but tying it together and helping accelerate that adoption by open sourcing some of the knowledge that is in the heads of sales engineers, that kind of thing. I think there's some real opportunity for what I would, throw back in the radical collaboration bucket.
Yeah, there's no doubt. And it requires new muscle for many of the folks on this call and the companies that employ us, because you have to kind of take competitive battle lines and put those on recess many times, or you have to walk into boardrooms and say, this is an area where we're going to collaborate because we're going to put community above competition. We're going to try in some way, as scary as this might be, to put community above capitalistic intent, in many cases. And that those conversations can be different, but you even among who's on this call, you see plenty of competitive overlap, and we'll see more and more as the vendor community gets more empowered to empower or more empowered to enable. And I'll say, when we started this little family of tech companies, among the growing group of our ranks now, we knew that it shouldn't necessarily be beholden, these smaller nonprofits especially shouldn't be beholden to figuring out all of our commercially available, let alone our more sophisticated points of integration, especially for ingredient technologies or APIs or more sophisticated platforms that don't just kind of get turned on and start working. And so I do think that's on us to build those blueprints, Chris, to your point, and make certain that we're not tasking a nonprofit, even if they see the value in having our things integrated per Adam's definition of value, don't necessarily have nonprofits pay for the canaries in the coal mine and the guinea pigs of integration in this world. We all have commercially available APIs, but it doesn't mean smart people that work with us and for us haven't put those APIs to work and made the recipes around them a lot more approachable and lowered the walls around those. And so I think as investors, as funders investing in this, like integrating our platforms, even if it's not that sexy, and building scalable open source blueprints around them is an interesting thing to consider. For companies, you have to to avoid sometimes your traditional way of doing business, to sometimes be in rooms that may cause a bit of discomfort and actually partner with other peers that you compete with also in some ways commercially. And fortunately, there are aggregators like TechSoup and others that do help make some sense of what we all offer. But I think that's on us. And it's the engineers down the hall from us or in the attic down the street from us now instead of downtown that can figure that out if we get them in the right position to do that and empower them through our programs.
I think there's a key point here, which is exactly what you said, Brian. Adam made a point earlier about the consumerization of tech and the consumerization of tech in our work. And you know, one of the key things is from a consumerization standpoint, consumer tech is all about absorbing the complexity so that the end user could have simplicity. And I think that we need to bring that similar mindset to the nonprofit space and to these customers and to the, you know, the basic problem of interoperability is how do we make this, because honestly, you know, if you're a nonprofit, you get some package, if you can't figure out in the first few minutes, it's now, you know, from a do no harm perspective, you're now distracting from the mission, you're not enabling the mission. And so we have to get into this mindset of absorbing our own complexity and owning it so that we can present a very easy, very, you know, both a trustworthy and secure, but also a very easy to, you know, an easy path to impact of all these different capabilities. And
I think when they start to get uncomfortable and the lawyers in our companies say, you can't do that, we actually need to say, no, we can, and here's how, and get the approval above their head. And that's being really clear and really, frankly, cutthroat about it. But I've had many people over the years tell me that there's no way that tech companies are going to start to get together and relax some of the scrutiny around the competitive battle lines and all that sort of thing. And I'm committed that they are and convinced they will. And I think you're already starting to see that. I'm glad we're on this call proving that.
Yeah, and Brian, you actually brought up an excellent point. So one of the things that we love, and this group of people specifically would love to talk about interoperability all day and like the trajectory of the industry as a whole, like that's something that we're just grossly passionate about. But like, say we're sitting on the other side and you're wondering, you're listening to this and you're like, okay, I think it'd just be great for our technology to be available to nonprofits. Like, how do you even get started with that? Like, how do I begin approaching that problem organizationally? How do I begin approaching that problem from a systems perspective? Like, what are some of the things that people should know about as they begin thinking about it?
I'm always getting that secondhand because people like Megamo, who really started this movement on our side, and the Chris Warmans and his peers of the world who helped, you know, other brands do that and start unloading their warehouses for nonprofits and so on. You know, these are the true trailblazers. So I don't know if Megamo or Chris wants to speak a little bit programmatically about it. Megamo from the vendor and Chris from the partner that helps distribute stuff. But I'm always happy, having done it a couple of times, to weigh in. But I certainly wasn't the first.
I think first step is, and it's the simplest thing out there, but it's where's the gravitational pull already happening? And it's sitting with the social impact sector is so damn resourceful and creative. You know, it was when I was working at a nonprofit based in Kenya before the cloud existed, and I was trying to find a company that had an online way to have a contact database I could share between my office in Kenya and Tanzania. And there was this little startup in San Francisco that I reached out to, and I was like, hey, I can't afford licenses from you guys, but do you think you could donate licenses? And they said, what are you talking about? We're called Salesforce.com. There's no way what does a nonprofit need with this? I said, well, I need a way to have my contacts in this place. Almost every tech company has some early adopter nonprofit that is trying to use their product to solve a problem. And I think that is the very, very, very first thing you got to figure out. And then to Brian's point and Meredith's point on, okay, if we see that there's a potential need there, how big is it? How wide is it? Is it very niche and focused? But once we kind of get an idea on what that is, what are the mechanisms within the company that we can build upon, and we can think of them as like social impact accelerators? Because the closer you can stay to those resources and to kind of aligning driving impact with business success, the more resources you're going to get to scale it out. But at the end of the day, it needs to start with who are the early adopters, who are those positive deviants who are finding a way to use this technology in a really impactful way, and what are the resources inside the company side that I can unlock to help maximize the impact we can have with those kind of orgs.
So do I need to formalize as a .org version of my organization before I start? Like, do I have to like identify 45 nonprofit customers that we already exist? Like, what's the minimum bar?
I mean, I think as you widen out just a little bit too, to Megamo's point, some of that resourcing is going to be, are there current employees who like to volunteer? Is there a propensity for the organization to weave some aspect of philanthropy or giving back into their culture? And if so, has there been a consideration to make that more skilled or more aligned with the company's superpower? Again, it's amazing too, especially when basic needs are of most vital concern right now in what are still troubled times, make no mistake. But soup kitchens and wearing hairnets is really important part of the day, but what is most scalable? And for some of us, it's data management. For some of us, it's, authentication and SSO and all the other acronyms I could go on with for an hour. But it's like, just find out where the gravitational pull is culturally, as well as from a commercial perspective and a business operations lens, but really see where the hearts are too. And it's amazing when you've got, brilliant finance brains and brilliant legal brains and brilliant technology brains in your companies. Many of those folks are just itching for an ability to be given a blank canvas, or at least a canvas with a few lines on it to start to direct where this should go. So I would almost say finding the balance, Matt, between being hyper prescriptive, but also like maybe engaging organizations, especially full of smart people, like most of the tech companies around the world are led by really smart people. Give them the problem and give them a safe space to start figuring out how they would solve it, as opposed to being perfectly prescriptive. And I think there's a place to meet in the middle.
I think one other area to just acknowledge is that there are communities of practice that already exist that can help you get started on this journey. When I first started doing social impact for technology back around 2001, 2002, the idea that a for-profit tech company had a social role was a very unusual position to take. It was not seen as a widely accepted place. And I think that we are in a much better place now with things like ESG reporting and other things around climate change. And so I think that there are more capacities in the industry to at least get started. So even if you're starting this bootstrapping effort inside your own organization, take a look outside and see and connect and collaborate with other folks who've already gone down this path. Because starting at this point, you probably aren't the first person to go down this path.
And Meredith, if you want to go. Otherwise, I was going to say you really do absolutely have to spend some time at Techsoup.org and take a look at their program. They serve 100 different tech platforms and offerings today, and they really can help map that journey out for a provider that's trying to find the right beneficiary, on the other side. And that's what they've been doing since the 80s. And so that's decades of awareness that can be channeled into programs that people would like to start, whether they're signing up for a pledge 1% pledge and they realize their product could be of value. There, to Rakesh's point, are lots of experts and people in the nonprofit sector, that do this for a living that would be happy to help.
The other thing I was just going to add, Bri, I think to a point that you made earlier, is engaging the folks, if you are in a tech company or honestly any company that's looking at opportunities to support nonprofits with, your kind of the unique way you think nonprofits might be able to use your tech, is that those, smart volunteers within your company may also be able to help think about like what else could be built or what else could be created to kind of augment your existing, your for-profit offering. Google Workspace for nonprofits, which was G Suite before, that was a bunch of Google 20%ers that were like, we need to figure out how to enable this. Like that wasn't the business saying like, yeah, let's like launch this free offering. So I think that's a really important thing to capitalize on as well, is that people interact with nonprofits in their personal lives. They're on boards, they volunteer, they have friends and family that work at nonprofits. So there's a lot of knowledge there that I think you really can leverage, especially at smaller organizations that are really racing to get going and excited about the opportunity. And the one other thing I'll add is, because I work at Google, this is what we think about all the time, but think about how you want to build for scale eventually. To Chris's point, the vast majority of the organizations that we can help in our communities are small organizations. They're probably never going to be at scale, the orgs that your sales teams are reaching out to have one-on-one conversations. So build for that, like build for the fact that somebody should be able to take this quote unquote off the shelf and hopefully be successful with it. And if that's not possible, then like, what's your game plan for, how you want to potentially help those organizations, or be really clear that your offering maybe isn't a perfect fit, so that people really can focus their resources and their time in the place that's going to be most helpful for them.
I think that's a super important point, Meredith, is that not only do you scale the product's kind of purpose to those that are never going to pay you a bunch of money as an organization, you also end up on the other side of that having to justify internal to the organization being able to service a number of organizations like that at scale, right? So that means it can't take a bunch of human effort every single time somebody requests it. And so we actually just went through that exercise at New Relic, and we partnered with Techsoup, in fact, to be able to programmatically approve globally any organization through their API that wants to be access to New Relic's products. And so in fact, we actually released an open source project to make that a lot easier for any organization on the planet that wants to do that, right, in partnership with Techsoup. We can post more about that later, so super excited about that one. But one of the things we had to just keep in mind was, we as humans they're not going to scale us one-to-one for nonprofits inside the corporate world. So we need to be ready to go to end scale for anything going on. I'm curious, Adam, because we haven't heard from you talk about that yet. Like, I'm curious how Okta has tackled that problem at scale internal to as you begin growing your nonprofit customer base.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's interesting. There are so many different kinds of companies out there, so many different people and situations. So it's very difficult to give helpful generalized advice. So if you'll forgive me, I'll speak directly from my experience here. I was very lucky in that coming into this role, the mandate was help more nonprofits around the world be successful with our products. The mandate was not a revenue quota. Not everyone is in that position. But partially, if depending on your company, you think about what your business model is and what makes sense, and think about, what are you trying to build? Are you trying to build a business unit, a P&L, right? Something that needs to cover its costs with revenue. There's nothing wrong with that. That's idiosyncratic to your company's needs and the way that you serve organizations, right? Where you fit in their value chain. When we think about, how do I get more nonprofits to be successful using this, not become customers, but successful, right? We don't just want to throw technology at people and call them a customer, right? We want them to be successful. One of the first questions was accessibility. It needs to be accessible. And we went out and looked at what lots of other companies were doing. Many of them are on this call right now. And there are some trends out there in terms of packaging products for nonprofits. Many companies take a donate then discount approach, right? Meaning you donate a certain amount and then you discount transparently on top of that, so that nonprofits who are trying to procure this stuff can know, without talking to a human being on the phone or on email, how much is this going to cost me roughly, right? So we strove for that kind of transparency. And one of the other things that we did was try to build a pricing model that was cost effective for us to serve these organizations. So, Okta is not a completely self-serve product. It does cost us something to onboard new organizations, right? It's not just the marginal cost of that, software license. And so we sort of took an 80-20 approach to the world of nonprofits. As Chris mentioned, the vast majority of nonprofits are small. for Okta, we're not expecting them to be able to pay list price or anything for licenses. So that is just free. But there are nonprofits in the world, we've talked about them. Some of them are large in terms of staff, some of them are large in terms of budget. They do have some money to spend on these things, and it is okay to charge a reasonable price, and you come to that with them, sometimes in negotiation and whatnot. So anyway, I say we took this 80-20 approach, the idea being 80% of nonprofits can basically use our stuff for cheap or free. And there are about 20% of the world's nonprofits that we have a value negotiation with. But it all comes back to that question of, what are we trying to build within Okta, right? Are we trying to build a social enterprise, or are we trying to do something else? And so that's what my advice would be to other folks trying to do this.
That's fantastic. And we do have a few questions that I want us to be able to get to, but just right before that, we've been kind of dancing around and even bumping into this idea of radical collaboration, and the fact that if you do want to get in and participate in this kind of conversation within the industry, it is possible. Obviously, there's a group of folks out there that are having this kind of conversation. Bri, want to give us literally 30 seconds on how do I get engaged, what's available out there for me, and what maybe is the next step to join something like that?
Yeah, regardless of your role, if you work for an organization that has wares that would be of benefit to nonprofits, then spend a few seconds at impactcloud.org and fill out the form and get in touch. One of the working groups that sits inside the Impact Cloud group would be in touch with you and just get a better sense for where the technology may fit in and what the readiness that your organization might have to participate and collaborate with us. The Impact Cloud focuses a lot on our origin area, which when we started it 5 or 6 years ago, we were focused on emergency response and humanitarian oriented projects. We've since widened the scope out to also include a few other joint investments and joint areas to focus, and then also become kind of an industry support network for one another and facilitate those 3 pillars as well as we can. So the action tactically, back to your point, Matt, is spend time at impactcloud.org, fill out the form, and ideally one of us in the coming days can get back in touch with you and understand more.
That is fantastic. All right, Lauren, you're gonna read us a few questions and then we'll have our panel answer them.
Perfect. This has been an awesome discussion, by the way. This is part comment, idea, part question, but we got one that said, Megamo is totally right. Nonprofit early adopters will almost always spur some innovative thinking for developers. I would suggest including at least 1 or 2 nonprofit folks on advisory panels that can share ideas and social impact perspectives, at least with product managers. What are tech teams willing to do to find and invite nonprofits? I'd love to hear responses to that thought. So yeah, take it away.
Awesome suggestion. And we should have had somebody, that was a good idea for next time for a panel like this. Bring the community in, damn good idea. Thank you for suggesting that. And I know I could speak on the Twilio side. We're actually pretty proactive in reaching out to folks to invite them. For example, we have a crisis response technology network where we get a lot of people from the community helping inform what are going to be the blueprints that we need to publish. What are those open source kind of resources that we publish out there? I'm not sure if others have other best practices they use.
Yeah, some people. Go ahead, Crash. You.
Oh yeah, one thing that we've been encouraging our folks to do is actually get out into the nonprofits. Like if you, from a development standpoint, I think the suggestions are a really good one about inviting nonprofits in to help suggest. The other thing that we're doing is we're actually asking some of our product managers and other folks to actually go out into the field with these nonprofits and see what the nonprofits actually are doing, right? Like get on the ground truth. So that you can actually come back and actually ingest that and help shape better products. And so, obviously the pandemic has kind of put a crimp in that, but to the extent possible, get out there as close as you can to the problems you're trying to affect and see what it's like to actually do that work.
Yeah, two quick thoughts for just on my journey. One is create an advisory board. Some organizations are putting those in a little bit later to get from a point of programmatic maturity to scale. So bringing in like really big companies to inform mid-sized companies and nonprofits about in on those advisory boards to support organizations. You can see the advisory board that we formed 6 or 7 years ago at box.org. A fun project, just search there for advisory board and you'll see that they're kind of industry heavyweights and thought leaders and people that people listen to, that they themselves work on the ground in many cases or instances. And then I'll never forget when we traveled abroad to a NetHope annual conference once, and two engineers and I from just the deep in the tech team at Box stood up in front of the CIOs of 37 large international NGOs. And instead of telling them what the Box platform was going to do for international NGOs, we literally just said, what would you like Box to do for you? And we put a Google Doc up on the board, these huge screens, and I just typed answers for 45 straight minutes. And the audience literally just peppered us with everything that the platform needed to do for the next 20 years to meet their needs. And maybe 6% of it got built, and the rest we found workarounds. But it was amazing to, on my first ever business trip, for them come back with 200 ideas that that the platform needed to pursue. So there's a lot of really creative ways to do this, to some of my peers' points.
The other thing I'd add, I'm thinking about here is the healthy tension between sort of anecdotal feedback and input and what we might think of as more like data, or for lack of a better word, right? Something that is more aggregate, that is more representative. We've already mentioned the research that TechSoup has been doing recently. Something that is at that level can show you macro level trends. Macro is important, right? It's not more important than the lived experiences of individuals. You need both. And so I would just mention that we should all continue to support both kinds of initiatives.
No doubt.
That's great. Okay, final question, and good luck answering this in 2 minutes or less. But how do we prioritize features unique for nonprofits that might not make it to normal backlog because of ROI in terms of revenue? Any thoughts?
I'm going to jump out first, just because then I'm sure other people have better ideas for this. But I think the challenge, both directions. So from a product offering that wasn't built with nonprofits in mind, and from a set of features that maybe we think are nonprofit specific, is being like open to the fact that there's use cases both directions. So I would hazard a guess that for the vast majority of use cases, it's probably not unique for nonprofits necessarily. It's just that if you work in a nonprofit, you're thinking of your unique use case. And if you are a salesperson who only ever talks to for-profit companies, you're thinking of like their unique use case. But in a lot of situations, I find that like you can actually make, you can sort of connect the dots between the two if you're creative about how to do that. And that's part of the communication, I think, for folks that work in social impact in tech, is being really good at translating between those two things. And for nonprofits, like, I'm sure I'm missing something, right? I'm sure there are like very specific use cases that maybe would be hard to figure out how to get those out of the backlog, but it's entirely possible that something that like really would solve a nonprofit need, it's actually going to solve a small business need, is actually going to solve the need of an organization that works in healthcare that maybe like wouldn't kind of traditionally qualify. So that's something to think about, is just there may actually not be as kind of walled a separation between the two.
Totally agree. Remember in the very early days when the Salesforce platform, I worked there for a while, was to help sellers, marketers, and later eventually people that do customer support. But the things that nonprofits were advising our teams, which included Megamo and Steve Wright and other people, was what our customers called Salesforce doing the cool stuff that it can do, which was actually life-saving in nature. And it was like, I was always saying from the sidelines, from the business side, before I joined the social impact side of the company, I thought, wow, good enough for like a humanitarian supply chain to get things to the last mile, probably good enough for chocolate companies, soda companies, petroleum companies. It's like, it's kind of the same context. And that's what really matters, is that the context, especially internationally speaking, is very challenged. And if you can figure out how these platforms work in the challenged context, or even the East Bay shelter that I spoke to earlier, where the woman has one cell phone and 5 lives, and 300, folks coming into her shelter weekly that she's trying to have as her extended family, that context is challenged. And to a degree, there has to be accessibility to that user too. So really, really appreciate what Meredith had to say on that point, because I think there's tons of broader value, but if you can get those same folks who decided that the workspace at Google was actually really important to get ready for nonprofits, they're going to help solve those other problems that are more sophisticated too. We certainly did things for the International Rescue Committee and Planned Parenthood and others that later became very commercially viable. I mean, even the NASA space program started out as something that was more, sort of public in nature, and that's been privatized and capitalized on. So there's a lot of analogies here. There are metaphors that can be tied to.
Absolutely. Well, it's clear that we could talk about this for much longer than the hour we had set aside for it, but it's time to wrap it up. So I want to say thank you to our incredible panelists and everyone for joining New Relic's Virtual Future Talks. Follow our meetup page for info on the next session and for future speakers, and have a great afternoon. Thanks, everybody.